In this video, we're going to talk about different types of assessments that you may use or encounter in your classroom. And I want to begin by thinking about assessment more broadly than just a standardized test or an end of the unit test, and really think about assessment as a cycle, something that teachers are constantly engaged with as they think about what their learners know and can do at various stages of the learning process toward the end goal of what you're hoping students will be able to do by the end of a unit. And as we think about assessment, it's also important to call back some ideas around backwards design, right? Understanding by design, which is a basic principle for designing for teaching, in that we start with the standards that we want to teach, or the focus of what we want to teach. Then we think about the end result. How will I know that students have achieved that standard? And then we plan learning activities. And too often, I think we go straight to learning activities and we skip the focus around the standards and the assessment, or we just use the curricula that we're handed and don't think about how all of these different pieces are connected. So I encourage you, whether you are a practicing teacher or a pre-service teacher, to think about assessment as something that is ongoing and as something that is giving you multiple indicators of students' progress towards a given objective or a given standard. So assessment really begins with pre-assessment, right? We're finding out. You want to know what students already understand about the content or the language that you're teaching, or what they already can do, so that you can then design instruction accordingly. The next important piece of assessment is formative assessment, and this really should be the bulk of assessment practices. It's assessment for learning, right? Assessment so that you can see what the student is doing, how the student is making sense of the content or language. So this is really a process of checking in and giving feedback. And this should be constant and ongoing throughout a unit so that you can continue to support the learner and design instruction based on where the learner is at that moment. And then finally, we have summative assessment, or assessment of learning. So making sure that they've really got it at the end of a unit or at the end of a lesson. So that's kind of your final assessment of student learning. And here I've summarized some of these ideas in a chart just to make it straightforward. So we have pre-assessment, and then kind of these two large buckets of assessment. Formative assessment, which is being conducted during or immediately after instruction. It's that ongoing feedback to inform teaching and learning. Tends to be informal and low stakes, but is systematic and planned. So it is something you're thinking about as you go into a lesson. What data will I be collecting, or what information will I be collecting to inform my understanding of what the student can do and to inform my teaching. So we'll look at some examples in a moment, but just a few here. Anecdotal records, so kind of keeping track, whether through notes or kind of a more organized chart of what the student's doing related to the standard. Exit tickets and whiteboard responses. We'll talk about all of these. Summative assessment, as I said, is really given at the end of a unit of study, is kind of showing mastery after many opportunities to engage with the learning. It's more formal, high stakes, but also systematic and planned. So you can see this overlap here, that assessment should be thoughtful and systematic and planned. And here, when we have summative assessments, that includes both assessments connected to your curriculum, like a unit test, but also tests that are standardized and given outside of the curriculum, but ideally still rooted in standards like the SAT, the RICAS, so those sorts of tests that students are taking. In the chapter that you read for this week from Herrera and colleagues, they really push for the need for authentic assessments as a different way to think about assessments, which they define as assessments that truly represent what students know and can do at that time. So they're unlike traditional assessments. And so here they're kind of thinking about traditional paper-based unit assessments. An authentic assessment is developed from classroom instruction. It often is focusing on real-world problems and how to solve them. It involves meaningful, engaging activities with multiple indicators of learning. And it also includes student participation in the evaluation process, often through the forms of peer feedback and checklists or self-evaluation that's embedded in this process. And there's many different types of authentic assessment that you read about, from performance-based, so having students do something, whether they're performing a skit, or for giving some other kind of performance of what they've learned. Portfolios are great. Having students gather multiple indicators of their learning and then kind of reflecting upon their portfolio. Self-assessment, interview-based assessments where the teacher is interviewing the student to kind of understand what they've learned or gathered about a given content or language goal. Play-based assessment, engaging students in play and assessing what they know through play. Cooperative group assessments. So assessment doesn't have to be individual. You can also assess what students can do as they work in a group. And there's different ways, as I talked about in the chapter, whether it's through kind of journaling or, regular feedback to the teacher about what students are learning individually as they work in a group. And then dialogue journals and scaffolded essays. So the opportunity to dialogue with the teacher or with peers about their learning, or have some support as they engage in writing. So all of these are ways to make assessment more authentic, and they're especially helpful for multilingual learners, because some of these reduce the language demand, and many of them allow students to engage in multiple different modes. So not just writing, that they are speaking and listening and writing and reading all together. Many of these are collaborative, so it gives students a chance to work together. And of course, many of these are more fun than a traditional paper-based test. I imagine many of you use these types of assessments already, but I encourage you to continue to think about ways you can make your assessments even more authentic. And I think this is a great visual from the New Jersey World Languages Curriculum Framework that just shows kind of the wide range of assessments that we can draw from. I think a really effective teacher, especially an effective teacher of MLLs, does all of these things or embeds all of these. So having more traditional ways of assessing students, selected and constructed responses. So you see like labeling things, filling in the blank, matching, conferencing, but then moving towards having kind of individual communication with students through interviews, through small group discussion, observing classroom interactions, how students are engaged, self-reflection, and then many, many ideas here for performance and products. All the different ways students, whether it's through a speech or a report or a debate, students can perform what they know, and show you in a variety of ways. All right, I want to shift now to talk about formative assessment, because like I said before, it really is like the bread and butter of assessment, because this is the day-to-day, these are the day-to-day assessments that will inform your learning and help you keep track of how students are progressing. And it can seem overwhelming to be kind of constantly gathering this information, especially when you teach many students across the day or have many things you're doing with students across the day. So we'll talk about some ways to make it really targeted and feel feasible, so that you can have this mindset of constantly keeping track and constantly checking in. So with pre-assessments, you want to know what students already know or can do. Some really easy ways to do that are through a quick quiz like Kahoot, which is great because it can gather information from individual students. So you have a quick record of what all of the students put into Kahoot, and you can just ask some questions to get a starting point for where your students are at. I love using activities like a gallery walk, where you might put some images or questions around the room and have students walk around and write something they know about that image or that topic or question, or any questions that they have. And so it gives you a chance to just kind of get a brain dump of what students know about the topic. And a similar, although slightly different way of doing that is through a graffiti wall. So these would be placed at tables around your room, and as students go from table to table, they talk as a group about what they know about the question, and then they each, with their own marker, add some ideas or what they know already to the topic, about the topic to the graffiti wall. So just some quick activities that can tell you a lot about where your students are at in terms of what they already know. During the lesson, again, it's important to continue to gather that information. One way to do that is through a stop and jot. So periodically pausing a lesson and asking students to jot down what they know, a question they have. Here you see this great stop and jot form that has a connection, a prediction, a question. So giving them really targeted things to think about as they quickly jot down what they're making sense of. And you can collect these and look and see, okay, throughout the lesson, what were questions that came up? And it might surprise you because a student who doesn't raise their hand and ask a question might still have a question that that needs to be addressed. And this is a way that they can put that there, or they might be making a connection that you can then call back to in another lesson. I love mini whiteboards, especially for elementary age students, as a quick way to see what students know and can do. When I was teaching second grade, I went to a local hardware store and had them just chop up a shower wall. It's very affordable. They can slice it right there for you. It's a very cheap way to get mini whiteboards. And you can use them for all sorts of things, for language related questions, for math, for any sort of question where you want a quick student response. And students love using whiteboard markers, dry erase markers. So it's one way to quickly get some feedback from all of your students. And of course, a turn and talk during a lesson, taking a moment to pause, having students turn and discuss something that you're learning about. And as a teacher, then walking around and listening in to find out how students are making sense of the learning. And I do encourage all teachers to think about anecdotal records as something that can be a part of your practice if it isn't already. Preschool teachers, early childhood educators are often very well versed in anecdotal records. It's a big part of supporting students who are learning when they're at that age. But it isn't just something that is for preschool. So anecdotal records, essentially, or very briefly, is just kind of taking notes about what students are doing with a focus in mind, right? So in this case, actually, this example is not seeing what they're talking about, but this is what students are doing as they write in their dialogue journals. So you can see this example from Margot Gottlieb's book, Assessing English Language Learners, where the teacher is just taking kind of quick notes about how students are using language, noticing some invented spelling, noticing some translanguaging, noticing that a student is writing exclusively in Korean at that point, and then continue to get supports as they move towards writing more in English. So this is just a great way to capture what your students are doing. And you can also do this as you walk around the room. You have kind of maybe a particular focus of the content learning or the language learning that you're hoping students will be using, and you're jotting down notes as you go. And of course, assessing after the lesson. So thinking about what your students learned or can do as a result of the lesson. Exit tickets are, I think, a really important and core formative assessment tool. I hope many of you use them already. So having students reflect upon their discussion, reflect upon their learning, reflect upon how their thinking has changed or something they still need help with. So there's lots of different ways to structure exit tickets, but it gives you a really quick way to see what students had taken from a lesson. When I was teaching, I loved to use Post-it notes for this purpose. And then I would make a pile afterwards. So if I was just teaching a math lesson, I would collect all the Post-it. I would ask a final, addition question or whatever it was we were learning. I have my students do it on the Post-it note and put their name on it. And then I would sort it into these piles. They got it, they sort of got it, they didn't get it. And then I would use that to inform my grouping for the next day. So the next time we had math centers, I would bring my students together who didn't get it, and we would do some reteaching, right? Or who sort of got it, and we could kind of do some clarification. So it's a great way to just get a quick pulse on what students understand, so you can then make some informed decisions. All right. So I imagine a lot of this is not new to you if you've been teaching for many years, but hopefully some of these ideas are useful as you think about how you're supporting all of your students through, or how you're engaging in assessment for all of your students, but especially for your multilingual learners. So take a moment to just kind of reflect on these questions. And this is where we'll end this video. So which of these assessment types and strategies have you used yourself or have you seen in practice? And perhaps which ones haven't you seen or used? What contributes to assessment tools being effective or ineffective in your experience? And finally, are there any other assessment methods that you have seen or used? So again, I hope that this has been a useful review or introduction to some of these concepts around assessment, and look forward to seeing your processing and thinking in the discussion board.